Hello class, welcome to the first of two videos on Aristotle, this one giving a more general overview, as well as focusing on Aristotle's main doctrines in logic, physics, and metaphysics. And the next one covering on the soul, the ethics, and the politics, and other miscellaneous works, as well as some of the fragments from Aristotle's lost dialogues. Now for most of you, the only time you'll really study Aristotle is in college. It seems that only intellectuals, philosophers, and theologians really get smitten with Aristotle and read him purely for pleasure. I think that would be a tall order in a survey class like this, but we'll do our best in the next 2 weeks to get to the bottom of what all the fuss is about. And so welcome to Aristotle, woohoo! For some, a great joy, a rationalist philosopher, and a real scientist, and for others, a great boredom. Ugh, Aristotle. His writings are so serious and technical. For the next couple of weeks, we'll try to balance the various Aristotles that the history of Western philosophy has inherited. To start, there is the actual man, Aristotle, the philosopher, who actually wrote popular philosophy books, none of which have survived, and ran the Lyceum, where he gave lectures. Only dense lecture notes, probably transcripts, have survived. To really understand the actual man, Aristotle, we probably need to speak Greek, which we don't, but we'll try anyway. Next, after the actual historical Aristotle, there is, like with other founders of the Western tradition, the myth and the legacy of Aristotle, which is thousands of times more enormous than the surviving writings we have, which are also pretty enormous, spanning two 1,500-page plus volumes in the Oxford edition. When we look at the myth and legacy of Aristotle, we have to gauge his impact on Hellenistic and on Abrahamic philosophy, that is the Judeo-Christian tradition, within which he becomes, earlier in Islam and later in Christianity, the most important philosopher of antiquity and the undisputed champion of the correct philosophy for over 1,000 years. Moving beyond Aquinas and Avicenna, there next follows a long history of caricatures as well as deep studies of Aristotle, and various takes on what Aristotelianism is really all about, and differing reconstructions. The man Aristotle was born in 385 or 4 BCE and lived only to the age of 62. He was from Stagira, a small city in Macedonia, that is far northeast from Athens and bordering on Asia Minor. His father was a court physician, and his father's empirical bent seems evident in the son. Like his father, Aristotle is committed to gathering theories from sense and observation, not just pure a priori reasoning. It seems he studied at Plato's academy, however, from a very young age, 18, and remained there for almost 20 years until Plato's death, and so very likely taught at the academy. He may have had issues with Speusippus, Plato's successor, for shortly after Plato's death he went to Assos in Asia Minor and spent 3 years studying biological subjects. Then he went to Lesbos, where he met his best student, Theophrastus, and then to Macedonia, where he became the tutor of the 13-year-old Alexander the Great for 3 years until his coronation. Aristotle then returned to Athens and founded the Lyceum, a competitor school to the academy which drew away many of its brightest faculties. The name of his school, the Peripatetic School, derives from peripatos, or covered portico, at the gymnasium, where he taught in the Lyceum and would walk around while teaching. From what we can gather, Aristotle's school was strictly devoted to the cultivation of the life of the mind and was not political in intention, but did teach politics. And more so even than Plato's academy, it cultivated interdisciplinary scientific inquiry into nature and biology and most everything. The Lyceum was in fact inside the temple of Apollo Lysias, that is, Apollo in his association with the wolf being associated in Indo-European languages with omniscience, a very fitting patron form of the god Apollo for the philosophical quest. Importantly, as a non-native Athenian, Aristotle could not own property. His position in Athenian society and his Lyceum was thus precarious. As anti-Macedonian sentiments rose, he was charged for impiety in 323 BCE, and he fled rather than facing trial, saying, "I would not let the Athenians make the same mistake twice, or sin against philosophy twice," referring to Socrates. Unfortunately, he died very shortly after his return to Macedon. It is probable that the young Alexander respected Aristotle, despite a lot of hype about his disinterest in the old pedant. In fact, Alexander was likely inspired in his models from Homer, such as Achilles, by Aristotle. And he may even have sent back biological samples from his campaigns to the philosopher. Alexander's positive attitude towards Aristotle may have changed after an assassination plot by one of Aristotle's relatives. At this point, Aristotle is said to have wanted to take revenge on Aristotle, but got distracted by his campaigns in Babylon and India. Sometimes later philosophers will say about Aristotle, he lived, he thought, and he died. That is all we know, and all you need to know. In Aristotle's case in particular, it seems the biography doesn't provide us very much help in understanding philosophy, and Nietzsche would have been hard-pressed to create a larger-than-life caricature of the great man Aristotle as he did for the pre-Socratics. On how to approach the corpus Aristotelicum, Heidegger remarks that most people do so merely academically, often in order to write a book. Aristotle himself, however, published only a very small part of his writings. We should not approach any of his surviving lecture notes as complete works, or part of a coherent edifice or doctrinal system. This fanciful reconstruction of Thomas Aquinas was pure fiction. In Aristotle, everything is open, and what are addressed are the basic problems or questions of philosophy. Scholars estimate that only 25% of Aristotle's writings have survived, and we're missing all the exoteric or popular works, so we'll read a few articles to reconstruct some of them. What we have are roughly 3,000 pages of lecture notes divided into 3 groups. The logical writings, known as the Organon, writings in various areas of the natural sciences, also philosophy of nature and metaphysics, writings in the areas of ethics and political theory, and informally not part of the triadic division, the miscellaneous writings such as the rhetoric and the poetics, understood as productive sciences, that is, teaching us how to do something, such as give a speech or enact a tragedy. The canonical organization of the main 3 branches of Aristotle's writings can be further broken down in terms of surviving works as follows. We'll be looking this week from the Organon at the categories and on interpretation. The focus in all these writings is scientific demonstration, what constitutes it, and syllogistic reasoning. We'll also be looking this week at the physics and metaphysics, metaphysics originally meaning just those lectures after the physics. And here we find Aristotelian natural philosophy, and what comes after it or goes beyond it, the philosophy of being and God, and also the works on chemistry, meteorology, psychology, which we'll be covering, geology, zoology, botany, optics, and mechanics. I tried to read all these other scientific works, not just the physics, metaphysics, and on the soul at one time, and they were so incredibly boring, I have to admit I wasn't able to get through them all. In the 3rd branch, we have the Eudemian ethics and the more developed Nicomachean ethics, as well as the politics. These works develop a theory of human nature and proper good or flourishing, eudaimonia, happiness of the human being, and we'll be covering them and on the soul next week. The differences between Aristotle and Plato are very often either overstated or understated in scholars. The Neoplatonists were also greatly influenced by Aristotle, and there are many thinkers in the Christian and the Islamic tradition as well who tend to underline the affinity of Plato and Aristotle's teaching. Some of the major differences that have been underlined, however, tend to portray Plato as a mystic or religious thinker focused on otherworldliness, and Aristotle as a this-worldly thinker. As opposed to Platonic transcendentalism, Aristotle's writings emphasize the empirical world and its close observation. Sensation and learning are prioritized over anamnesis or recollection of the forms, and Plato's doctrine of the immortal soul and the rational part is renaturalized in Aristotle's conception of the human being as a rational animal. In Plato, principles are everything, and they are so as well in Aristotle, but with a stronger emphasis on scientific research. Despite these differences, all of which are arguable, Aristotle remains extremely close to Plato in innumerable points and all over the place. In fact, emphasizing the continuities rather than the ruptures was more common among the educated elite until very recent times. Aristotle's critique of Plato's theory of the forms, he notes that Plato's doctrine of participation, methexis, of the instance with the form, is not well explained. The forms or ideas multiply the number of objects that need explaining, and they leave the relationship of universality and particularity unexplained. Lastly, the forms leave us without a robust account of change. The formal cause or form is one explanatory principle for the thing, but not the end-all and the be-all of everything. There's also the material cause, the efficient cause, and the final cause. More on all these in a minute. It's also probably fair to say that Aristotle analyzes forms more logically, that is, in clearer language and in terms of formal causalities, but also less mystically and venerationally. Let's sum up now Hadot on Aristotle's school. Hadot's main point in this chapter is that in Aristotle's Lyceum, Nothing is less like theory than the theoretical way of life. We are used to reading Aristotle as a thinker who privileges the pleasures of the mind, but we must learn to see this as a way of life and a school. The difference between Plato's Academy and Aristotle's Lyceum is most essentially that the latter was not political in aim. The goal of philosophy is a philosophical life. And this is because the other types of life always depend on external factors that cannot be controlled. The life of pleasure destabilizes us and is unsustainable externally and internally. The life of politics requires us to be politicians. That is, to depend on others, to go to war, etc. Only life according to the mind is independent, and it brings marvelous pleasures and the highest happiness, and is the most sustainable. However, it is never attained all at once, but only in moments as far as possible. For Aristotle, the theoretical life is the closest to God or the divine, and represents the highest form of human happiness, and it can be said that such happiness has something superhuman about it. Then man no longer lives qua man, but insofar as there is something divine about him. For Hadot, this paradox corresponds to Aristotle's enigmatic view of the mind and the intellect. The intellect is what is most essential in man, yet at the same time, it is something divine which enters into him. In this way, what transcends the human constitutes its true personality. Quote from Aristotle, "The mind is our self insofar as it represents that which decides and which is the best." As in Plato, philosophical choice is what leads the individual self to go beyond its limits to a superior self and to raise itself up to a universal, transcendent point of view. When Aristotle wants to make us understand the mode of life of thought, he declares, its way of life is comparable to what, for us, is the best way of life, which we can live only for short periods of time, for it always remains in this state, whereas for us, this is impossible. Accordingly, deity for Aristotle is always contemplating sovereign beatitude. If then the deity is perpetually in a state of joy, comparable to that in which we find ourselves sometimes, that is admirable. If, however, he is in a state of still greater joy, then that is still more marvelous. The summit of philosophical happiness, the activity of the mind, the contemplation of the divine intellect, is accessible to human beings only in rare moments. For the proprium, or what is proper to the human condition, is that it cannot be continuously in actuality. Our lives are determined by potentiality, becoming, change, and eventual dissolution. And this implies that for most of life, the philosopher must be content with an inferior grade of happiness, which consists in searching. Now, to understand this doctrine of the contemplative life as the best and most divine, we need to rethink our naive distinction of theory and practice. For Aristotle, cultivating a theoretical attitude is practical because it leads to the best way of life. Nowadays we say, oh, that's just a theory, and opposed theory to action. This distinction is foreign to Aristotle's writings. There is, however, within them a distinction between the theoretical and the theoretic. Theoretic from thea oros, to see the sight, meant to the Greek mind the life of a spectator or emissary to a festival or religious ceremony, that is, a messenger sent to see the marvelous sights and report back to his home city on what he saw. For us moderns, the word theory has been almost totally eroded by anti-intellectualism, something abstract, uncertain, and probably useless. The transformation of the institution of the theoros or emissary to a festival or religious ceremony, as a spectator of the unfolding events, is pervasive in Greek culture, but Aristotle uses only the term theoretical, never theoretic, to describe knowledge for its own sake, as well as the way of life devoted to knowledge and wisdom. The model of the theoretical attitude is the deity and the universe, the nous, or cosmic mind. And the theoretical attitude is deeply ethical, a virtuous practice in which we become better people and pursue wisdom within an ethics of disinterestedness and objectivity. Aristotle's conception of the good life as the theoretical life does not privilege the scholar alone, but all types of engaged scientific and practical activity, including the amassing of a huge number of facts and the drawing of general conclusions and points of view. While knowledge of the greatest and most distant things is to be desired, we would do best by learning about the smallest and what is very near, such as the life of plants and animals, since everything participates in the divine in some sense. Hadot notes importantly how the Aristotelian attitude to nature is very loving, much like contemporary botanists or zoologists. While the lofty philosopher in the Platonic sense might object to studying little animals, in fact, every little thing in nature, when properly studied, reveals that it is marvelous and affords incredible pleasure to the one that studies it. It is in this context that Aristotle relates the anecdote about Heraclitus warming himself by a fire or common hearth, saying, "Here too the gods come to presence." For Aristotle, this means we must approach inquiry concerning each animal or other little thing in the world as if there was something natural and beautiful in each one. Although Aristotle is often credited with founding a strict distinction between culture and nature, technai onta or fabricated beings, and phusai onta or beings of nature, he is also most deeply animated by loving the art of nature. According to Hadot, in Aristotle, humans merely imitate the art of nature, but human art, in a sense, is merely a particular case of the fundamental original art of nature. And this is why natural beauty is superior to all artistic beauty. Even repulsive things can be beautiful in Aristotle and worthy of being studied. When we derive pleasure from seeing artistic representations of ugly and repulsive things, it is because we admire the art with which the artist has imitated them. So why should we not admire nature's skillfulness in creating her works, especially since she makes beings grow from within and practices, as it were, an immanent art? If we seek nature's intention and the finality she pursues in her action, we will find pleasure in studying all of her works. The intimate link between knowledge and affectivity in Aristotle is expressed in the following phrase from the Metaphysics: "The supreme desirable is one with the supreme intelligible." Nous, or understanding, intellect, is what we human beings actually desire, or exus. And Aristotle's guiding will and passion here could be also expressed by a remark of Kant: to take an immediate interest in the beauties of nature is always the sign of a good soul. And from an Aristotelian perspective, Kant's disinterested delight is a close analogue to the pleasures of theoretical praxis. Here, the philosopher is dynamically theoretical, not just scholarly, but a whole person, and a path of gradual and sudden initiations and illuminations into what is most divine. Hence, in his lost work on philosophy, Aristotle compares progress in philosophy to graduating stages of initiation, seeing, and knowing, like the religious initiations at the mysteries of Eleusis. Of course, in Aristotle, philosophy practices a higher and deeper degree of initiation than the Greek mysteries, since these latter don't really concern learning at all. More on that next week. Aristotle was not only animated by the project of an all-encompassing human knowledge, but also keenly aware of the limits of knowledge. According to Hadot, no one was more conscious than Aristotle of the limits of philosophical discourse as an instrument of knowledge. First of all, its limits come from reality itself. Everything simple is inexpressible in language. Second, language's discursivity can express only what is composite and what is divisible successively into parts. But it cannot say anything about indivisible things, such as the point in the domain of quantity. At most, it can say something negative by denying the contrary. In the case of simple substances, like the first intellect or principle of movement for all things, discourse cannot express its essence, but merely describe its effects, or else proceed by comparison with our own intellect. It is only in rare moments that the human intellect can rise to the non-discursive, instantaneous intuition of reality, insofar as it can imitate the divine intellect in some way. The limits of discourse also stem from its inability to transmit knowledge to the auditor all by itself. And this is even more true of persuasion. Discourse cannot act on the auditor without the latter's collaboration in his soul. For learning and knowledge and its limits, slow assimilation is required, and the right disposition and the habit to learn any new subject, which is the opposite of how learning is done today. According to Aristotle's version of pedagogy, the auditor's soul must be worked on for a long time in order that it make good use of attractions and repulsions, just as we turn over the earth which will nourish the seeds. Only when students really acclimatize and listen repeatedly and for a long time to the discourse of a philosopher will the seeds of knowledge be planted, and only then will the citizenry become capable of virtuous politics. On politics, Aristotle, by contrast to Plato, believed that the philosopher's activity within the city should be limited to forming the politician's judgment, but that it is the politician's task to act personally by their legislation to ensure citizens' moral virtue. The philosopher, for his part, should choose a life devoted to disinterested research, study, and contemplation, a life which will ultimately be independent of political worries. Now that completing our general introduction and overview to Aristotle's philosophy, to the orientation of Aristotelian thought, let's turn now to the Organon, the first logical work we'll be covering this week, Aristotle's Categories, and its core concept of substance. It seems that the logical writings were conceived by Aristotle as an instrument designed to clear away common misunderstandings and articulate a meta-perspective on how philosophy should be approached. When first reading the logical writings, the impression is formed we're dealing with linguistic and grammatical issues, but this is not the case. Although issues of language and how things are said correctly or incorrectly or with more refinement are often at issue, the basic thrust of all Aristotle's logical writings is ontological, having to do with predication, is statements, and what can be truly said about things. These logical writings are particularly unforgiving in their obscure writing style and probably made a lot more sense in Greek to a Greek-speaking audience. For us, they require a lot of head-scratching and attempting to get a sense of what Aristotle means by particular terms. The biggest takeaway from his text, The Categories, for our purpose, is their articulation of the doctrine of substance, which can be translated both as what underlines and the thing itself, and how we can speak correctly about things in their essential nature as substances, and especially how to attribute predicates or categories to substances correctly. In the broadest sense, it is from Aristotle's Categories that we derive what is known as subject-predicate metaphysics. On primary substance, Aristotle writes, "What is most properly, primarily, and most strictly spoken of as a substance is what is neither asserted of nor present in a subject." Ugh, what on earth does that mean? Clearly, everything rests on understanding what Aristotle means here by substance and subject. Things hardly get any clearer when we read what is usually taken to be the explanatory sentence of this first one. Everyone who reads these sentences for the first time is almost completely lost. So let's do the work of setting this up properly so we know what the heck Aristotle just said. This part of the video may be a bit boring for many, your professor included, but just bear with it if you can. I promise we'll be getting to the more juicy parts of Aristotle soon. At the beginning of the Categories, Aristotle sets up a logic of predication, how things are properly said about other things. There is equivocal predication. We say a man is an animal, and we also say a picture of a man is an animal. But in substance, only the man is the animal, not the picture. So predicates can be equivocal. Next, univocal predication. We say a man is an animal, but also an ox is an animal. Here, the predicate animal has the same definition in both predications. It is a univocal predication, having the same meaning in both instances, not like the difference between an actual man and a picture. Next, there is derivative predication. Don't say that someone is grammatical or agrammatical. Point out that their statements are so in light of the field of study. Next, there are composite expressions such as man runs or man conquers. These bring two expressions together. The category man is not by definition running, nor do we already think the idea of conqueror when we think the idea of the human being. For Aristotle, the point here is that running and conquering are things that man does. Now, Aristotle's whole interest here in predication is in is statements and how they work. Man is mortal is a true is statement. Man is a rational biped, yet another man is a political animal. If these statements are all true regarding man, then they'll be true about every particular man. Socrates is a mortal, a rational biped, and also a political animal. In all instances, to a certain thing is attributed a certain predicate. The key difference here is that Socrates is a particular man. Aristotle is going to call this a primary substance or actual thing, whereas man is a general category, the form being something that is said of the substance but is not itself the substance. Aristotle is going to call these general categories secondary substances and argue that they can be either genera or the species of a thing. So far so good, and this basic distinction seems clear. Primary substance, the man Socrates. Secondary substance, the category or form man. Some predicates inhere in primary substances or things. These you can remove without changing the nature of the thing. Other predicates, the forms or categories, are said of things. These you cannot remove without changing a thing's nature. Take away my beard, and I'm still me, Even if every girlfriend I've ever had would beg to differ. Take away my mortality, and I would be no longer a man, but rather a god. This may all seem very abstract, but it has a pretty practical import. A particular man belongs to the species man, but the genus to which this species belongs is animal. And so we speak not only of primary substances, things themselves, but also of secondary substances, their forms or attributes. When speaking of secondary substances, distinguish between those which are incidental or inessential and those which are essential. And regarding these essential ones, they transcend their instantiation in particular primary substances. Again, Socrates is a man, a primary substance, but man or an animal are spoken of as secondary substances or forms. This is pretty technical and not necessarily the most felicitous use of the term secondary substance, but I hope we can kind of see what Aristotle is on about. Okay, so let's try that really difficult first passage again. What is most properly, primarily, and most strictly spoken of as a substance is what is neither asserted of nor present in a subject. In other words, this sentence defines the very concept of a primary substance or thing. We can distinguish the primary substance from the secondary substances because to isolate the primary substances, we are saying more, merely what can be asserted of them, attributed to them by predication, than the attributes that inhere incidentally or essentially in the subject. In other words, Aristotle is using the term substance, ousia, to mean pretty much exactly the same thing as subject, or hypokaimenon, the thing itself. More examples: Socrates is bald. The attribute of baldness is in the subject, Socrates. By said of a subject, Aristotle means sentences like, Socrates is a man. What is said of Socrates is the species to which he belongs. This is the more general lead-up to the argument that the individual subject, Socrates, is the basic or primary substance, whereas species or genuses, such as man and animal, are substances only in a secondary sense, since they would not exist at all if individuals did not exist. There are a lot of finer points about predication to work out here in Aristotle, and not all of them accurate. For example, Aristotle says that the color is one of those things that is in the substance. We know that's not true, but most of the ins and outs of categorical predication in Aristotle are fairly accurate and a little bit interesting. For sure, this is the first text in Western philosophy to break all this down. A key point often reiterated is that specific or species-based categories say more about a substance or thing than generic or genus-based categories. I.e., we say more about a thing when we call it a man, rather than when we just call it an animal, since everything said of animals is also said of men, but not vice versa. And in chapter 4, we will learn that simple expressions signify either a substance or a quantity or a quality or a relation or a being in position in space and time, or possessing or acting or being acted upon. We don't need to worry about this here, but many later philosophers will develop this passage into enormous philosophical systems such as Immanuel Kant and also Hegel. So the distinction of primary and secondary substances is quite difficult and needs a little bit of further drilling in from the text itself. Here a reiteration a little later. Everything except primary substances is either said of a subject, which is a primary substance, or is present in a subject, which is a primary substance. And a little further, if primary substances did not exist, it would be impossible for any of the others, the secondary substances, to exist. Of secondary substances, the species is to a higher degree a substance than a genus of it, for it is closer to the primary substance than the genus of it is. Primary substances are said to be substances in the highest degree because they underlie all the rest, and all the rest are either predicable of or present in primary substances. Only the species and the genera of primary substances should be called secondary substances, for of all the predicates, these alone as predicates indicate the presence of a primary substance. Moreover, it is because they underlie all other things that primary substances are called substances in the most fundamental sense. Primary and secondary substances are not present in a subject because they are more elementally what that subject or thing is. And this leads to the doctrine that primary substances can be the bearers of contrary properties, such as old, young, pale, flushed, etc. But they can have these contrary properties without changing the primary substance or the secondary substances. When you change the substances, you change the thing. Let's look finally to a few of the most helpful statements in the categories. Every substance is thought to indicate a this, i.e. an indexical demonstration, this coffee cup. Now, in the case of primary substances, there is no dispute, and it is true that a primary substance indicates a this, for what is exhibited is something individual and numerically one. But in the case of secondary substances, it is not a this that is indicated, but rather a quality or a property, or a general or specific essence or form. Another mark of a substance is that it has no contrary. It is rather the bearer of contraries that do not affect the identity of the primary and secondary substances. Also, substances do not admit a variation of degree. The primary substance simply is what it is, and the secondary substances are either predicable of it or not. And so the contraries that a primary substance like Socrates and a secondary substance like man bear are things like virtue and vice, waking and sleeping, standing and sitting. Accordingly, it is only a substance that, being the same and numerically one, has the property of admitting contraries in virtue of its own change. So Aristotle concludes, let so much be said concerning substances. Why is Aristotle's category so dang hard to read? According to Heidegger, this is because A. Aristotle is a very deep thinker. Categories are actually ontologically oriented rather than merely grammatically or linguistically. And B. We simply don't understand him as we should if we can't read Greek well. It can very often seem to us that Aristotle's language lacks all the character and fullness that comes from the depths of our own language. And this is why it is neither pleasing nor polished. What's happening when we read Aristotle in this way is that we're simply not thinking what Aristotle thought in our translations. Each word that Aristotle uses has been leveled and eviscerated of its Greek context. We can take here three examples, the fundamental words category, substance, and subject. You may have noticed the usage of all three of these terms seemed to shift constantly in the text we just read, leaving us confused as to what Aristotle meant exactly by each term. Let's start with the term itself, categoria. Before becoming a philosophical term established by Aristotle, this word meant addressing of something, or in Heidegger's German, ansprechen. In Greek, kata agoruein most commonly meant to accuse someone in his face in the agora, the public court, of being the very one who, and to address something as this or that, and putting that thing forth into public view as open and manifest in the way that it is. As a philosophical term, categoria acquires the special meaning of addressing something present as something, this house or this tree as something open to our field of vision, yet standing on its own, a thing. What is being addressed as standing on its own is, in Aristotle's terms, the substance, ousia, something present in its presence. The substance is addressed in terms of quality, of what sortness, with a view to its beingness. So in Aristotle, categoriae comes to mean addressing things in judgments, that is, giving a logos of them. And Kant still utilizes this technical meaning, and in the Critique of Pure Reason, he provides his table of categories as primary and then relates those to his table of judgments as secondary. Hegel too departs from Aristotle's categories here. The absolute knowledge of the knowable occurs through representation, or Vorstellung, the very notion of representation being embedded here in Aristotle's doctrine of secondary substances. Now more on the terms substance as well as subject. Heidegger notes that Aristotle's Greeks for substance is ousia, again what is present in its presence, as something that comes to a stand before us. Subject, or hypokaimenon, is what underlies or lies present. For Heidegger, the only acceptable translation of ousia is not in fact the Latin substantia or essentia, which is misleading and will end up always confusing us. Rather, what ousia means more simply is beingness, what a thing is. The word ousia was not originally a technical term any more than the word categoria. It signified the house and home, holdings, and present assets. And the difference between hypokaimenon, subject, and ousia, substance, is not a grammatical issue as it might sound. The hypokaimenon is not the same as the subject of a sentence. Rather, it is what does not come to presencing or standing in the ousia, at least on a first glance. The ousia or primary substance is thus the thing itself, and the hypokaimenon or the subject is also this thing itself, now named in the aspect of what does not appear, at least not immediately. Only when we understand categoria, substance, and subject in these Greek ways can we understand Aristotle when he says that physis or nature is like a subject because it seems to lie inside all things and direct their course. But he also says that phusis is ousia, what unfolds substance and its way of being. Given all these translative complexities, let's wonder when, if ever, we will really be able to read Aristotle. For Heidegger, the whole point of the categories is the Greek understanding of being, is, and how we make is statements regarding the things that stand on their own, and how these things in their beingness are also determined by what lies present within them, the hypokaimenon, or in Latin, the subjectum. Both these terms, ousia and hypokaimenon, the object and the subject, equal weight in Aristotle. Again, the discussion gets unmanageably complicated for a simple overview video here. For our purposes, we can note that if what Heidegger has said about issues of translation in these three fundamental words is true, more or less completely invalidates the translations of Aristotle we have. We would have to use completely other terms than the Latinized category, substance, and subject to really get many of Aristotle's sentences in the categories. Let's look now at another one of these Latinized terms that are associated with the Aristotelian tradition, essence. A word we all know as what a thing essentially is, its nature. Now for Aristotle, an essence is a form belonging to a substance, or ousia. And it is, in each instance, that form which makes the substance the thing that it is. Without the characteristics that define the essence of the thing, it could not be what it is. Attempting to bring this together rather preemptorily to an overall picture of Aristotle on primary substance, we looked at this diagram. The primary substance is the thing itself. It's the bearer of forms which define its essential nature, as well as of matter, houle, which is part of what underlines the substance and is the subject, or hypokaimenon. The primary substance in its becoming, in a way, charts a journey from matter to form and back again. Primary substance is also situated in Aristotle in the forward movement of time and its sequence of befores and after. The thing carries its potentiality for change or transformation within itself, and what it unfolds in the passage of time is its actuality, becoming the thing it is. More on how form and matter, potentiality and actuality interact in Aristotle's doctrine of substance in a minute when we look to the physics. Covering the Nicomachean Ethics in more detail next week, before getting further into Aristotle's physical and metaphysical doctrines, important to know what Aristotle means by the term knowing or knowledge. Book 6 of the Nicomachean Ethics, he speaks of 5 intellectual virtues or faculties of the human mind as modes in which the soul is true. These faculties are techne, episteme, phronesis, sophia, and nous. And like Plato, Aristotle distinguishes techne, knowing how to do something, from episteme, having a correct perspective or knowing that something is the case. And he also distinguishes phronesis, practical knowledge, knowing what to do in a given situation, from sophia, theoretical reason, knowing why things are the case. Aristotle's doctrine of knowledge here is very sophisticated. Techne and phronesis, knowing how to do or produce something, and knowing how to respond appropriately in particular situations, are faculties of concrete or calculating reason, which Aristotle calls logistikon. Episteme, knowing that something is the case, having adequate access to what is known about a thing or field of knowledge, and sophia, knowing why things are the way they are, their essential grounds or principles are both faculties of abstract or theoretical reason, epistemonikon. According to Aristotle's account of the intellectual virtues, knowing that, episteme, guides and supports knowing how to do something, techne, and knowing why, or the principles of things, guides and supports knowing what to do in specific situations. Aristotle suggests in the Ethics that all these intellectual faculties are required and come together philosophical insight, or nous. Nous is the mind that understands being itself, first philosophy, God, as well as the being of beings, which is second philosophy, or scientific inquiry. This is an even clearer articulation of the distinction between transcendental and empirical reasoning than in Plato's divided line. All these modes of knowing for Aristotle together constitute knowledge, but knowledge is always divided between theoretical and applied, epistemonikon on logistikon. Cultivating the intellectual virtues, and beings as rational animals do the work of reason. They acquire theoretical insight or wisdom, sophia, as well as scientific reasoning, episteme, scientia in Latin, as well as intuitive understanding, nous, and practical wisdom or practical reason, prudence or phronesis, and also the knowledge implied in the crafts, skills, or arts, techne. Now note, all 5 of these intellectual virtues are not moral virtues. We'll talk about the moral virtues more next week. In his doctrine of knowledge, Aristotle continues in the Platonic tradition of understanding episteme, knowing, as a capability or faculty of the mind. Aristotle's epistemology is often called an empirical constructivism that is grounded in the observations of experience, as opposed to Plato's intuitive rationalism, grounded in the supernatural or transcendental ideas. But this is not the whole story, since Aristotle's theory of knowledge has 2 sides. There is the rationalist theoretical side, which he'll eventually in the Metaphysics call first philosophy or ontology, the knowing of being itself, and the truth of categorical relations as such, that is, knowing all the secondary substances, they are defined and related. This is the a priori element in Aristotle's thought. It's in fact very close to Plato's intuitive rationalism. Theoretically, it is an overstatement when we emphasize Aristotle as an empirical scientific thinker rooted in experimental method as opposed to Plato. But in terms of the scope and thrust of Aristotle's philosophy, it is true that his empirical scientific side, rooted in observation and generalization from the observed, is much stronger than in Plato. And thus the various scientific disciplines under the purely theoretical, richly developed in his writings in his school. And this involves the knowing of things in the world in terms of the categorical statements that we refine through their observation, although not yet strictly in Aristotle through experimental method. Next, Aristotle also formalized logic in some of the further works of the Organon. Logic supplies a non-psychological criteria for goodness in the form of argument. It seems to be in part for Aristotle a corrective to the sophists, as well as an extension of some of Plato's intuitions regarding logic. Aristotle is famous for being the first to develop a system of deductive inferences, that is, in evaluating inferences among various propositions and the art of the syllogism. Statements are sentences that can be either true or false. Does this predicate really apply to this subject? And the terms of a statement are what make it up, these terms being based on the categories as the fundamental qualifications of primary substances. And so within Aristotle's logic, terms are themselves secondary substances or attributes represented logically. Not assigned, but essential for any brief overview of Aristotle's philosophy, we need to define what demonstrative knowing is in Aristotle. He begins his posterior analytics by arguing that all teaching and all intellectual learning arises from pre-existing knowledge. This is not the same, however, as Plato's doctrine of recollection. The pre-existing knowledge spoken of here is that acquired by learning, sensation, and memory. And Aristotle adds that this is true both of syllogistic, that is demonstrative, as well as inductive arguments. For Aristotle, again demonstrating his rationalist bent, scientific knowledge is related to what cannot be otherwise, and such knowledge is produced through demonstration, in the form of the scientific syllogism. For example, all A's are B's, all B's are C's, therefore all A's are C's. For this to work, the premises need to be true. And so Aristotle writes, demonstrative knowledge must necessarily depend on premises which are true, primary, immediate, and better known than, and prior to, and causes of the conclusion. If a syllogism does not meet these conditions, it does not constitute a demonstration and so produces no knowledge. However, if the premises of a syllogism are universal, then the conclusion of such a demonstration must also be an eternal truth. And this is why, for Aristotle, pretty much defining the field of inductive reasoning here, there can be no demonstration with respect to perishable things. When it comes to the objects in the empirical world, we should not let the categorical or metaphysical structures of our perception and systems of knowledge interfere with observation and evidence. Ultimately, what the syllogism demonstrates is formal relations, not facts about the external world. On the truth of statements, Aristotle famously writes, "To say that what is not, or that what is not is false, and to say that what is, and that what is not, is true." Sounding very much like Parmenides here. This basic doctrine of truth will be developed in Hegel, for whom truth is not found in isolated statements, but is the whole of a completed system of knowledge. This is not quite what Aristotle meant, his emphasis being on the truth of the statement, not the truth of the system. So in a way, this accounts for Heidegger's schism from Hegel and return to Aristotle, although without the formalism. What Aristotle says is correct for Heidegger It discusses only the true, not truth itself, since truth itself is not located in the statement or the system, but in the veiling or unveiling of being. To say of it that it is green is to say something true. To say that it is not green is to say something false. For Thomas Aquinas, what Aristotle is saying about truth and true statements, pretty much the truth is important because it's the path or way of an adequation of our intellect to things, that is, of the human small participation in the nous to primary substances. More simply, truth is a correspondence to reality, and its locus is the statement, which adequately refers to the real. This is not the final word on Aristotle's doctrine of truth, merely its logical aspect. In regards to the statement, in several passages in other works, Aristotle as well, especially in his doctrine of theoretical wisdom or insight, sounds more like a Heidegger or a Shakespeare. Truth is truth to the end of reckoning, and concerns the eternal or divine in human life. Simplest takeaway for the prior and posterior analytics might look a little like this. Aristotle, there are four basic kinds of statements in regards to being true or being false: affirmative statements, negative statements, universal statements, and particular statements. And in order to determine such statements logically, so as to assess their premises and possible inferences to deduction, we have to see how these modes of the statement are often intertwined. For example, the affirmative statement, all men are mortal, its logical form being all S is P, is both affirmative and universal. The statement, no men are mortal, no S is P, is both negative and universal, and here clearly false. And in the case of the logical analysis of this statement, in terms of its variants, we discover that none of them are true, but for another statement, some of these modifications might have been true. Lastly, before we turn to Aristotle's On Interpretation, we can examine this graph of the logic of statements. All S is P is contrary to no S is P. Logically, when it comes to contrary statements, they cannot both be true, but they may both be false. When it comes to particular statements, some S is P or some S is not P, these are known as subcontraries. They cannot both be false, but may both be true. Furthermore, no S is P implies that some S is not P, although this is trivial. Just as all S is P implies that some S is P. When it comes to universal affirmative statements, all S is P, they are always contradictory to particular negative statements. And similarly, negative universal statements like no S is P are always contradictory to particular affirmative statements. Aristotle's main target in his logical doctrine seems to be the sophistical analysis of these topics. For Aristotle, logic provides a criterion for evaluating the goodness of arguments, that is, their validity, which is independent of the persuasiveness of the argument, emphasized by the sophists. Validity is solely a matter of form and is intrinsic to the argument, while persuasiveness is an external matter of how the argument affects people. Thus, logic helps us detect bad arguments even when they are persuasive. So much for our purposes on Aristotle's logic. Our textbook selection from Aristotle's On Interpretation concerns his notion of the future, and the question, how do we apply truth conditions to statements about the future? Something will happen tomorrow by necessity, but it seems that thing might not happen. Hume's famous example will be the sun rising tomorrow. Saying that it will and it will not occur are both logically sound. Statements about what will happen tomorrow are hypothetical, and they can end up being true or false. How, therefore, should we understand the truth character of the statement that the sun will rise tomorrow? If it is true, does that mean the future is determined by necessity? If it is not determined, how could it always be true today when I say it? Aristotle next points out that all propositional statements either affirm or deny, and are always either true or false. And he also affirms the principle of necessity or necessary causality. Everything that happens happens by necessity, and this means it has a strictly determinable cause for its happening, even when we can't determine that cause precisely. When we speak of future events in propositional statements, we speak either truly or falsely based on what actually occurs in the future. It will be is a different type of statement than it is. All future events occur of necessity by the principle of causality, not by chance. And so when we make propositions about future events, even events 10,000 years from now, they are either true or false, period. We could not say, oh, well, they're neither true nor false. Rather, the objects or events spoken of have the potentiality to become so or not to become so, and other events might intervene. This means for Aristotle that all statements about future events are hypothetical, even if they still have an, to us, inaccessible truth value. He writes, "Now when things exist, it does so of necessity, and when a non-being does not exist, it is of necessity that it does not exist," sounding like Parmenides. But it is not of necessity that every existing thing exists, or that every non-being does not exist. For it is not the same thing for a thing to exist of necessity when it exists, and for that thing to exist of necessity without qualification. Thus everything of necessity either is or is not, and everything of necessity will either be or not be, but one cannot always truly state that a definite one of the two alternatives is or will be by necessity. Again, very confusing, but what Aristotle has done here is to invent the logical category of the hypothetical statement. And the main takeaway is, in his example, that a sea fight either will or will not happen of necessity tomorrow. That the statement is hypothetical does not mean the actuality is. The hypothetical nature of a hypothetical statement says nothing at all about necessity in nature. The truth character of our hypothetical statements, when they turn out to be true, refers to the possibility of said events, but not to the event itself, which always occurs by necessity. Okay, our coverage of the organon is done. Let's turn now to the promised juicy stuff, Aristotle's Metaphysics and Physics. While it may not sound particularly exciting at first glance, Aristotle's analysis that being itself is said in 4 ways is actually pretty stunning. When we say that anything is, or we talk about the being of a thing, the being of beings, such statements always divide into one of 4 types. We speak of being in terms of contingency and necessity. It could have been otherwise versus it had to be this way. In terms of true or false, which is mostly to do with the truth value of is statements, but also has to do with the state of the soul that perceives realities. We speak of being in terms of the categories, what something is, and how to address it, its attributes or secondary substances. And we speak of being in terms of potentiality and actuality, potentiality as a possibility of becoming, and actuality as a statement of existence. Franz Brentano wrote an entire book on this 4-fold sense of being in Aristotle. The epigraph quote, coming from later in the Metaphysics, "Being is a homonym. Its several senses fit into the 4-fold distinction of accidental being, on kata symbebikos, being in the sense of being true, on hos alethes, the being on of the categories, and the potential and actual being, on dunamai kai energia." It was discovering and reading this book which had the most profound influence on the formation of Heidegger's thought other than Edmund Husserl. We again say primary substances are things, and secondary substances are attributes or forms. These are the first 2 and most important points of Aristotle's metaphysics. Now when it comes to explanatory grounds for natural things, there are always for Aristotle 4 becauses. The material cause, the matter out of which something is composed, the silver in the silver chalice, the formal cause or the shape of the chalice. In the case of an artifact like a silver chalice, the formal cause is the form of chaliceness, but in the case of natural beings, the formal cause is built in as an entelekia and part of the inward directionality of the thing in its becoming. Next, there is the efficient cause. In the case of the silver chalice, this is the silversmith and is what does the causing, i.e. produces the silver chalice. In the case of natural beings, the efficient cause for Aristotle is physis itself, and in some instances the divine is spoken of here as well. And lastly, there is the final cause, end or goal, towards which the thing tends. In the case of the artifact or silver chalice, the final cause is its purpose in a ritual. But in the case of natural beings, the final cause is the inbuilt entelekia, sometimes by nature and sometimes by the divine. The material cause determines what a thing is made of. The formal cause determines what a thing is or will be. The efficient cause determines the process by which it was made or where it came from. And the final cause determines the purpose for which it was made. We are used to distinguishing Aristotle's physics from his metaphysics, but these distinctions are arbitrary. Lecture notes that come down to us as the physics are separated from those which we call the metaphysics only by later editors. Metaphysics meaning here only those lectures coming after the physics and concerning problems which we are led to through the study of physics or nature. In any case, Aristotle's physics and metaphysics are teleological. Every part of the world serves some function or purpose within the whole, with these purposes being either by nature or in some instances by human culture and design. The term for the indwelling final goal of each thing is again entelechy or entelecheia. This brings us to our textbook selection from Aristotle's Physics, Book 2. So far, we've approached the main argument of Book 2, or B, of Aristotle's Physics precisely as we should not, totally out of context, and as if Aristotle's doctrine of the four causes simply fell from the sky as some sort of wonderful, strange, and irrefutable eureka. Our textbook gives us a very brief introduction and some key parts of Book 2. But if we really want to get the most out of Aristotle's most influential book, we really need to know what we are reading and why. And here we're going to turn to Heidegger's 1938 essay on the essence and concept of physis in Aristotle's Physics, B1. Heidegger begins from the observation that nature, natura, comes from nasi, to be born, to originate, and is the same as the Greek root gen, genesis, origination. Nature has become a fundamental word to designate all beings that exist in the world and even being itself. Prevalent dichotomies we're almost always stuck in include nature and grace, i.e. supernature, nature and art, nature and history, and nature and spirit. And yet we also speak of the nature of spirit, the nature of history, the nature of human beings, by which we mean what things essentially are and how they are. Aristotle's physics is so hard for moderns to understand because we are in the wake and the shadow of the Christian thought of nature, for which the human being's natural state means what is bestowed upon human beings in creation and turned over to their freedom. Left to itself on this model, nature, through the passions, might bring about a total destruction of the human being. And for this reason, nature must be partially suppressed. It is, in a certain sense, what should not be. In another interpretation, it is precisely the unleashing of drives and passions that is natural for the human being. And thus, according to Nietzsche, homo naturae is someone who makes the body the key to the interpretation of the world and secures a new and harmonious relation to the sensible in general. Yet a third image of nature, and perhaps the least foreign from the Greek notion of physis, can be found in Hölderlin's poem As When on Holiday. Here, nature becomes a word for what is not only above everything elemental and everything human, but even above the gods. As Hölderlin sings, "Now day breaks, I yearned for it and saw it come, and my word for what I saw shall be the holy. For nature herself, more ancient than the ages, and above the gods of Occident and Orient, nature awakens with a clang of arms, so that from high ether down to low abyss, by unswerving law, as once begotten from holy chaos, nature herself feels herself renewed, the inspirer, the all-creating." Heidegger comments, "Here nature becomes the name for what is above the gods and more ancient than the ages in which beings always come to be. Nature, in other words, becomes a word for being, being prior to all beings, to which all beings owe their being. And the gods likewise, to the degree that they are and however they too stand under being. Seen more fundamentally, nature is never merely one term in a dichotomy, rather beings as a whole and their fundamental interpretation or revelation to humanity. Thus, in all such dichotomies, nature is not just one of two equal terms, but essentially holds the position of priority, inasmuch as the other terms are always and primarily differentiated by contrast with and therefore determined by nature. In Western metaphysics, which emerges on the basis of Plato, although after Aristotle, nature is taken to be a one-sided superficial stuff or matter, unformed, and spirit correspondingly as the non-material, spiritual, creative, or that which gives form. This fundamental metaphysical duality seems to be already well on its way to formulation in Plato's theory of two worlds, but it is not how Aristotle understands the matter. There being no strict distinction between physis and idea in Aristotle, except at the limit of the one divine being or mind, the unmoved mover, who is in the end not the creator or responsible for nature, but more of a contemplative deity, acting upon nature only through the distance of contemplation. For Heidegger, one thing is certain: the differentiation of nature and spirit is simply foreign to the Greeks. According to Heidegger, the main point of reading Aristotle's physics is to get clearer about what we mean by nature, physis, or the essence of nature. When we do this, we are asking about the being of nature. At one moment in Aristotle's physics, physis appears as substance, ousia, growing things, phusai, and at another as the hupokaimenon, subject, what lies under and is the origin of present things. Heidegger underlines there's absolutely no distinction whatsoever in Aristotle between physics and metaphysics. Thinking about physis is already metaphysics because it is the knowledge of physis. And so studying Aristotle's physics in the right way, we can learn philosophy from it in a fundamental way and even reconnect with what the pre-Socratics called physis. In the most sensational claim of his whole essay, Heidegger writes, in italics, that Aristotle's physics is the hidden and therefore never adequately studied foundational book of Western philosophy. Its 8 books, however, are not always thematically connected. It is not a systematic whole, and the second book may have been written around the time of Plato's death. Heidegger again notes how the translation of Aristotle's Greek into a scholastic neo-Kantian style obscures everything. The proper way to approach the physics is as the first thoughtful and unified conceptualization of physis in Greek philosophy. But it's also in this regard the last echo of the original and thus supreme thoughtful projection of the essence of physis in the pre-Socratics. Book 2 is indeed the key to the whole work. Book 1 describes the method to be followed. We must be led towards epagoge physis so as to be able to speak of beings as from or by physis, and to distinguish what is from or by physis from other modes and types of beings. When we do this, we discover A, that all beings from and by physis are defined by movedness, that is kinesis or motion, and B, that this movedness points beyond itself to being. In the realm of nature or physis, everything is in motion. The key is to understand the being of this motion. It's where from, it's where to, it's how, what, and why. In giving his first definition of physis as kinesis, Heidegger avers it is actually very difficult to see what Aristotle means. To say the essence of physis is kinesis is neither a triviality, nor a truism, nor a tautology, but rather the formative essential insight of Western humanity. Certainly, previous Greek thinkers had experienced all beings in nature as in motion. Only Aristotle, however, considers being moved as the fundamental mode of beings from physis. This does not mean beings from physis do not also rest and stand still. Their standing still or resting, however, happens on the basis of their movedness. Rest or stillness here is a modification of motion for natural beings. We must look further into the movedness of beings and see what physis is in relation to this movedness. And here we meet Aristotle's age-old distinction between natural beings and fabricated ones. Like the doctrine of the 4 causes, we mistreat this idea as fallen from the sky. In Aristotle's words, of beings as a whole, some are from physis, while others are by other causes. By physis, as we say, are animals as well as their members, parts, likewise plants and simple elements of bodies like earth and fire, water and air. In these cases, physis is taken as the cause or origin, in Greek, the aischon, cause. Arche, origin, or German Ursache, is not just causality but being responsible for a being being what it is. Aristotle, but all the aforementioned appear as different from whatever has not composed itself by physis into a stand and stability. What appears in and by physis is not an object standing over and against a subject, but a presencing into appearance within the world. Now Aristotle doesn't only say that the essence of physis is kinesis, but also that physis can be discerned because in beings from physis, the arche of this kinesis, the origin of this movedness, is from itself. Indeed, each of these beings that are what they are and how they are from physis has in itself the originating order, the arche of its movedness and its standing still, where movedness and rest are meant sometimes with regards to place, sometimes with regards to growth and diminution, other times with regards to alteration or change. Heidegger points out how in this foundational passage, the word used to describe physis is now arche, usually translated as commencement, commandment, not aischon, meaning responsible for or cause. Arche means beginning and control, an originating order, and an ordering origin. And for Heidegger, it is not an archaic concept. We only find it in Stamatellos as principles and testimony concerning Anaximander due to the doxographers. From physis is kinesis, we move to physis is arche, origin and ordering of movedness and rest. Plants and animals are in movedness even when they stand still and rest. This observation has proven true in physics and biology. Everything in the world may seem to be resting, but it is fundamentally in motion. And not just orbital motion, but motion from within itself, atoms in the stones, cells in the animals and plants. None of these beings which are in motion from the arche of physis have this origin for themselves or explicitly know it. They are in motion from the arche of physis, but their motion from physis is not self-willed. Certainly, animals and human beings can move themselves about through acts of will. We are not in the first instance responsible for the movedness and the origin of the kinds of beings we are as living beings. In fact, physis, nature, is what rules within beings, originating and ordering them. And thus there are many types of motion from physis according to Aristotle, not just kinesis katatopon, change of place, movement in place or positionality. This is only one type of movement from physis. But it's this type of motion alone, change of place, which is determinative for the modern scientific concept of motion, itself a ghost compared to the dynamic pluralism of natural motion. In fact, seen more precisely, locomotion or self-motion in animals or humans is relatively the least common type of motion. The most important type from physis is change in place, metabole, and thus Aristotle's text leads us by apagoge towards change and its basic understanding. A plant is rooted in place and grows and increases or withers, decreases in that place. And conversely, something that moves insofar as it changes its place can still rest by remaining as it was constituted. For Heidegger, we of today must do two things. First, free ourselves from the notion that movement is primarily change of place, and second, learn to see how for the Greeks, movement as a mode of being has the character of emerging into presencing. This would involve a rethinking of the very notion of place, topos, in Aristotle. Reviewing, physis is archekinios, the origin and ordering of motion and change, such that each thing that changes has this ordering within itself. And it is only from out of this basic definition of physis that the contrast with teknaionta is introduced. Here, the key point is that a couch or a bedstand or a robe or anything fabricated by human beings has absolutely no impulse to change arising from itself. However, insofar as it also pertains to such things, to be made of stone or earth or a mixture of the two or other matter, these fabricated things do have an impulse to change, but they have it only to this extent. This is a fairly fascinating passage, and it really does not suggest a strict distinction between fabricated and natural beings, since the world of fabricated beings or teknaionta still in their basic stuff from physis. A technically produced artifact is finished, it is the product of a making or technique, and its being is defined by its maker, form, for the sake of what? But it still has physis in it, insofar as it might decay or change. Wood from which a bed is made might actually on occasion put up a few new shoots, if it is planted in the ground. It is the wood which is from physis, not the form of the bed. According to Heidegger, we are so determined by seeing the world metaphysically, in terms of our own categories, we easily overlook a special kind of motion and rest from nature. I hardly note that it is the distinguishing characteristic of the being of natural beings. Why does this happen? Because under the spell of our modern way of thinking, we are addicted to thinking of beings as objects and allowing the being of beings to be exhausted in the objectivity of the object. But for Aristotle, the issue here is to show that the artifacts are what they are and how they are precisely in the movedness of production, and thus in the rest of having been produced. What Aristotle is showing us about our technically fabricated world and the peculiar form of eternity, or finishedness that is its signature, is that all the things around us are still from physis, have another arche, are related to that arche in a particular way. The arche of artifacts is tekne, the goal telos of tekne is the finished thing, and its origin is not the image in the mind of the producer, but his activity. All Aristotle means to say here is that in the sphere of teknaionta, their arche is not in themselves by physis, but in something else, the architecton or the maker. And because of this, their continued movedness by physis is only ever on account of what remains of physis within them. As artifacts, their being is finished in being brought to a stand. Technical artifacts, as technical artifacts, no longer have their arche kinesios within themselves, but beings from nature do. This leads to the first complete definition of physis. Heidegger calls Aristotle's definition here simple and severe. It leads us to look at physeionta anew in terms of their self-enfolding emergence as inherently going back into itself. Nature is not the motor in things, or their organizer or coach, nor is it the animation of the organism. Rather, nature itself is what unfolds and infolds as arche kinesios, the origin of movedness. And Aristotle drives home this point with the analogy of the doctor, who can only heal himself as a doctor, but can only be a doctor on the basis of physis. And Heidegger notes that even the wonders of modern medicine don't invalidate Aristotle here. No medical technique will work if physis is not on board with the cure. So far, I've gone over only the first 20 pages of a 60-page essay, and we don't have time to cover all the ins and outs of the rest of the piece, but I'll try to summarize the main points of what follows. Physis is now defined in the physics not only as arche kinesios, the origin of movedness, but also as ousia, or beingness, the being of a thing. That is from physis. And like categoria, ousia was not originally a philosophical term and did not mean substance. It meant what lies before, a present that presences. Aristotle's physics is here attempting to get us to see epagoge physeionta in terms of their essence and as self-moving. And he himself says it is ridiculous to want to prove that physis is, because everything that is always already appears from and by physis. Thus, physis cannot be the premise of an argument, but rather is something present. And just as there are colorblind people, there are people who are blind to physis. In fact, a lot more of them, quips Heidegger. Speaking of nature or physis in terms of the origin of motion and as beingness, ousia, the next stop in the physics in Heidegger's essay is physis as matter and form. Many pre-Socratics, including the Eleatic antiphon, argue that what properly is in physis is the matter, the hule, the elements. But this isn't what primarily shows up and reveals itself in physis and its kinesis for those who are not blind. In fact, what shows up and reveals itself primarily in nature is not the elements themselves, the hule, the matter, but the morphe, the form, the eidos, coming into the open and taking a stand. We grasp the being of physis from both the matter and the form, but the form tells us more than the matter. The matter or elements are only more stable from the point of view of what underlies rhythmic changes. This was the Ionian position, and Heidegger here mentions Democritus. But the being itself is more accessible in what something becomes, that is, in its shaping or form, morphe. We'll discuss the relation of matter and form in nature or physis more in a moment. The next major distinction covered in Aristotle's discussion of physis is the eternal versus the temporal, and we are barely equipped to understand this distinction in Greek terms. We see the eternal as infinite duration, the permanent, and the temporal as finite duration, the fleeting. But for the Greeks, the thought of eternity, eideon, is what comes to presence and always is. This was opposed to what constantly changes and becomes without limits. In fact, in Greek thought, eternity or being is limited and is over and against ceaseless fleeting change. The ie in the Latin aeternitatis means being as what presences into the unhidden, according to Heidegger. And the investigation into the being of physis, the being of nature, seeks the eternity of ousia, as it seeks what comes to presence and always is through physis, and thus the beingness of the many beings from physis. Now more on how matter, form, potentiality, actuality, and logos are all involved in Aristotle's discussion of physis. In the modern way of seeing the world, the being of nature is simply stuff or matter. Greek hule, or what Kant called the determinable. It originally meant materials for building and producing. But again, we learn more by studying the being of physis in terms of form, morphe, or what Kant called determination. This term originally meant shaping, and the shape placing into appearance. Morphe here in Aristotle's physics is not very far from Plato's eidos or idea. Aristotle does not consider morphe and form to be independent. The distinction of matter and form is very important in outlining the concept and the essence of physis, but it is not the same as the distinction of potentiality and actuality. As both potentialities and actualities can be either material or formal, potentialities and the process of actualization are features of change, metabole. Matter and form, however, are more closely connected to what always is, ousia, beingness, and what can be properly said of the world. and hence the pre-Socratics focused their interpretation on hule or matter. Plato focused his interpretation of nature on form, and it falls to Aristotle to work out what's really going on in this transition from Ionian to classical thought. More on dunamis and energia, or potentiality and actuality, in Aristotle, and its relation to indwelling final goals. When speaking of matter as having potentiality, Aristotle discusses the wood's appropriateness for becoming a table and only a table. Here, the telos of matter is to become an artifact. But when speaking of the acorn, he speaks of its potentiality for becoming a tree, that is the form of a tree, morphe. The tree is by and from physis, and here the telos or end is the form itself, the tree in maturity. The tree reveals the physis of its wood to a far greater degree than does the table. And here Aristotle provides the fundamental word of his thinking according to Heidegger, which embodies the knowledge of being that brings Greek philosophy to its fulfillment. This is the Aristotelian notion of entelecheia, what follows or fulfills itself. And this he names the basic concept of Western metaphysics. A being that has its fullest form in itself becomes what it is, and only from here do questions about metaphysics become possible in the first place. Okay, so we're now in a position to start bringing this all together and draw some more general conclusions. Beings from nature, from physis, are in motion, kinesis. Physis is itself the arche kinesios, the origin and ordering of this movedness of natural beings. But when we ask what the beingness of beings from physis is, we can answer with Aristotle that it is entelecheia. It is not just that beings from physis are ordered by some external thing, physis, but rather they have physis, the principle of their origin and ordering in themselves. And all natural beings are an entelechy in this sense, not only plants and animals, who achieve their form or become what they are from within themselves by physis, but even the stone and the twig come to their fulfillment or being as entelecheia. The movedness of all beings in nature consists above all in the fact that the movement of a moving being gathers itself in its end, telos, and as so gathered within its end has itself, en telai ekai, having itself in its end. The finished stone, just standing there as a stone, minimally fulfills this definition of entelecheia as a being from and by physis, although the animal or plant fulfills it to a much greater degree in realizing its inbuilt form, maturity, or fulfillment. Heidegger notes that sometimes, instead of using the word entelecheia, which Aristotle himself coins, he also uses the word energia, actuality. In energia, in place of the word telos, stands ergon, the work, in the sense of what is to be produced and what has been produced. The actuality or beingness of natural things reveals them each and all as being an entelecheia. But the mode of being of technically produced things is more related to ergon, energia, standing in the work. Where work means that which stands fully in its end, that is finished and produced or fulfilled, das Vollendete in German, which does not mean the concluded any more than telos means the concluded. Rather, for Aristotle, both telos and ergon are defined by eidos, form. They name the manner and mode in which something stands finally and finitely in its appearance. And in Heidegger's interpretation of Physics B here, the end of movedness and change of physis in a given physionta means its rest or fulfillment, a having become what something is. Now Heidegger passes over the doctrine of the four causes almost completely in his in-depth reading of Physics B. Why? Because it becomes obvious given what he has said. When we speak of things in terms of their becauses from and by physis, we can point to their matter, form, efficient causes, either by physis or techne, or final causes, either as artifacts or as entelecheia, following themselves. When we think of the four causes in terms of physis, not just techne, we give a physical explanation. When we focus on the techne dimension, we invent metaphysics, usually in the bad sense. For Heidegger, Aristotle's metaphysics is not a different kind of inquiry, however, than his physics. Rather, it develops from the physics, further thinks nature itself, or physis, as being. The key idea in Aristotle's metaphysics, often touted, is that energia precedes dunamis, actuality precedes potentiality. Framed this way, it seems just plain wrong and self-contradictory. Of course, something must be possible before it can become actual. Nevertheless, Western philosophy and science concur with Aristotle here, although often meaning something totally different. For example, when philosophers speak of the forms, actualities, or essences as preceding existence, or when scientists speak of the law of the conservation of energy. Energy can be neither created nor destroyed, only changed and transformed. This as well, although in a minimal sense, names the priority of energia over dunamis. There must be something there in actuality for change to occur, and thus for potentiality to be possible. What exactly did Aristotle mean by the precedent of energia over dunamis? According to Heidegger, energia, like dunamis, categoria, ousia, are essential basic concepts through which being is thought in classical philosophy. They are modes of presencing. When Aristotle says energia is prior to dunamis, he means something more like the modern concept of supersession, more in being. Energia more originally fulfills what pure presencing is, the realization of the finite fulfilled appearance. The energia or form of a tree is in the seed in some sense, but as yet only in potentiality. Nevertheless, energia is what guides the actualization of potentiality in its mode of being, and hence is prior. It takes precedence just as morphe or form takes precedence over hule or matter. The interpretation of physis as hule, dunamis, that is, as matter or elemental stuff in Ionian natural philosophy, is, according to Aristotle, a steresis or privation of the very essence of nature. In fact, what physis reveals and moves towards as entelecheia or morphe form tells us more about the being of natural things than any reductive interpretation of nature in terms of a primordial stuff. The physis in phusaianta is a being on the way, Greek hodos, towards something, and thus a genesis, a becoming. Becoming is what has not yet achieved its telos. It is an energia atelos, an actuality, which has not yet achieved its finished form, and thus in an ongoing process of self-placing or formation. And here physis, as a kind of self-making, comes very close to techne, but it is not a poesis of something else, rather an autopoesis, a self-making. Physis in natural beings has its ends in itself, not in something else. The analogy of the doctor is evoked again. Even if a doctor practices medicine in order to attain a higher degree of techne, he or she does so only in order all the more to reach the telos of restoring health, provided, of course, that we are talking about a real doctor and not a medical entrepreneur or a time server. Now, the motion proper to physis is a going back and forth, and at the same time a going back into itself, much like in Heraclitus's fragment, physis cryptis thai philai, nature loves to hide. Furthermore, the materialist interpretation of nature is only possible on the basis of the concealing of physis into the basic stuff, and is a derivative mode of presencing or a steresis, deprivation of the full essence of physis. Physis in Aristotle is indeed twofold, material and formal, but the formal aspect, or eidos, is more in being and shows us more about physis. The mere stuff interpretation of nature is a kind of exorcism of genuine seeing, a saying away of what shows itself in physis, a desert of thought versus a spring of thought. Form as the becoming or way of nature is always between a not yet and a no more. That is always in the process of becoming. And according to Heidegger, here directly quoting Aristotle's physics, when we conflate mere matter as the essence of nature, we have only discovered the essence of all non-essence. Nature is nothing other than the origin and ordering of motion. And so when we study nature, we study the beingness, ousia, of beings from and by physis. In Aristotle's Metaphysics, it sometimes looks like physis is just one branch, one type of being in the many-branched tree of being. And it might seem like the metaphysics, the study of being itself, is not the study of nature, physis. But in fact, Aristotle's Metaphysics more emphasizes the opposite. Ousia, being, beingness, is nature itself. Heidegger considers this an echo of the great beginning of Greek philosophy, the first beginning of Western philosophy in the pre-Socratics. And it is in part because of Aristotle that we cannot help but refer to the nature of things, by which we mean the being and essence of those beings. Heidegger concludes the essay, "We should leave reductive understandings of nature and the philosophy of nature to its own ruin. It is always, in the last analysis, forced to acknowledge the embeddedness of its field of study within physis. When we speak of physis, we speak of the being of beings as a whole. By physis, this more holistic perspective appears here and there, but also loves to hide itself. Our relation to nature can never wholly be about purging nature of its self-hiding, such as in Cartesian science. Rather, all genuine approaches to physis shelters and secures both its revealing and its self-hiding. This may sound very mystical, but it more conforms to what gifted scientists and philosophers actually do when they experiment and when they think. The self-hiding of physis can never be ultimately overcome or stripped away from physis through revealing the, quote, secrets of nature, and this is because being is self-revealing, concealing physis itself in the original sense, and only as such can it be a phenomena of coming into appearance and self-showing, or truth, aletheia. Now, in his 1926 lectures on the basic concepts of ancient Greek philosophy, Heidegger turns more explicitly to Aristotle's Metaphysics, naming it the scientific apex of ancient philosophy. Here, Aristotle did not solve all the problems, but he advanced to the limits which Greek philosophy could reach, given its general approach and problematics. And he unified in a positive way the fundamental motifs of all previous philosophy. After him, a decline. The basic breakdown and structure of Aristotle's Metaphysics, Book A, is first, a presentation of earlier philosophies, a critical summary, and the aporias in which they found themselves, and also the Pythagorean theory of number leading to Plato's theory of ideas. Metaphysics A provides the basic traits of a general theory of science, oriented towards the idea of a fundamental science. All essential expressions for knowing, apprehending, understanding are here terminologically stamped, specifically over and against what had been the case earlier. These expressions now differentiate the matters at issue themselves. And it is in the Metaphysics that Aristotle most comprehensively presents his own concept of Sophia, or wisdom, as knowledge regarding principles and causes, arches kai etias. The knower or wise person, the sophos, stands at the head of some matter and understands it in terms of its principles and causes. And knowledge and wisdom are thus something existential and by degrees. The goal of Aristotle's philosophy is to attain truth, aletheuein, to take something out of concealment, to make unconcealed or discovered. And the human being discloses other beings and itself, the world and being. What is needed on the path to wisdom, or the highest kind of scientific philosophy known as the theoretical? First of all, aesthesis or sense perception, as what is present in every case yet enclosed in its relations. Next, we need memne or retention and memory, as a knowledge of what is not present and what has already been apprehended. And thus Aristotle's starting point is not merely perceptual, but a matter of the kind of insight proper to human beings, to the phronimos, the insightful one, mathematikos, the learned one, both of which are needed for the mastery of images and memories, of fantasia and memne. Next, we need techne, knowing one's way about a thing, deliberating, technique and craft. And next, empiria, or experienced, being practiced. For example, in the art of thinking, which is distinguished from thinking. And empiria or experience takes many different forms. Ultimately, it leads to concept formation, that is, knowing the hypotheses of appearing things, anticipating and cognizing them. But lastly, through correct sensation, memory, technique, and experience, the individual on the path of wisdom becomes a sophoteros, someone who sees more, experiences more by possessing the logos, and is able to teach and guide the view. This is not yet wisdom itself, as it does not yet tell us why, but it's the last step before genuine wisdom. Metaphysics A, Chapter 2, we hear about the characteristics of wisdom. We speak of wisdom in the everyday sense in many domains, but speaking more precisely, wisdom is not practical, but a path of transforming one's own being, a specific type of comportment. What wisdom guides is the everyday view of things and modes of access to them. Wisdom concerns A, all things, B, difficult things, C, rigorous things, D, instructive things, E, things for their own sake, and F, supreme things. What is essential for the cultivation of wisdom is the, quote, capacity to question, draw from, and develop in conformity with the matter itself at issue. And for Aristotle, wisdom alone is free, that is carried out in free openness, the very source of human freedom, for which the matter at issue is the sole criterion. We cannot read Aristotle's Metaphysics without once and for all understanding that Sophia is the highest instance of understanding and is science in the proper sense. It is the most divine science. For Aristotle, a science is divine insofar as 1, it is such that God possesses it most properly, and 2, it relates to something divine. Both of these hold for the science of the first principles and causes. God is for all things something like their origin and cause. The very being of physis, or more precisely, the very being of physis is divine. And so this science is an absolute and free mode of consideration, and thus befits God most of all, who is himself the pure, eternal gazing upon beings, and is a gazing upon this very gazing, anoesis noesios. And so, in Aristotle's Metaphysics, wisdom or Sophia becomes for the first time theology, theologiki. On cause or aision in Aristotle, we can begin from the quote, "The object and theme of the most proper science are the first principles and causes, their plethos number and eidos outward look. These causes are narrowly restricted to 4 we have already learned. Why this many and why these particular ones? Nowhere is a strict proof given. Perhaps the methodological possibilities for such a proof are not even available." Nevertheless, Aristotle saw clearly that something remains open here. He attempted an indirect proof by showing that these 4 causes and no others were disclosed one after the other, and he hoped that this insight will give us a higher pistis, that is faith or belief, in the necessity and character of these causes. Prior to the causes, however, or principles themselves, what is the being of the principle? The being of the arche. Here the metaphysics distinguishes a double concept of fundamental science. 1, there is the science of being itself, and 2, the science of the highest and most proper being. And this is because what properly is are the things that actually are, and what properly constitutes them, being. Heidegger notes, what is here the purely ontological problematic was, to be sure, not fully mastered. It would appear later in completely different contexts, whereby this ontology was taken up into that of God and man. On Aristotle's Theology, Max Charlesworth writes, Aristotle was the first to really work out ontology in its relation to the science of beings, and also the first to coin and emphasize the term theology. According to Charlesworth, there is in reality a definite and strong religious or theological orientation to Aristotle's philosophical system as a whole. His prime mover or unmoved mover is not any kind of absentee landlord, or, to vary the analogy, a deistic god who winds the world up like a clock and then leaves it to run itself. For the influence of the prime mover upon the material world is direct, instantaneous, and constant. And so in Book 10 of the Metaphysics, we hear Aristotle on the divine, arguing that it is as a final cause that God acts on the world of mutability and all the various changes in the universe, from the rotations of the heaven to the changes of material sublunary things, which are seen as attempts by matter to approximate as far as possible to the perfection of God's eternal and immutable activity or dynamism. Or in Aristotle's own words, it has been handed down from the dim ages and left to posterity in the form of myth that these principles, the stars, are gods, and all nature, physis, is set round with the divine. The rest is mythical accretion designed to cajole the popular mind and to be used in the interests of law and utility. But if we strip this off and take the central fact alone, that they are called the primary substances gods, it may well be thought God-inspired. So far and so far only are the beliefs of our society and those handed down to us by our ancestors plain and true for us. Aristotle nowhere says that God creates nature out of nothing, as in the Judeo-Christian conception, but Aristotelian physis is still set around with the divine, influenced in its character of entelecheia in each and everything by God, and by the gods who can be considered here primary substances. The clearest mode of access to the being of this God is to understand being as being, which is for Aristotle first philosophy and also theology. This is not being opposed to physis, but the very being which is at work and in play throughout everything which is from and by physis. Charlesworth calls this a very radical conception that Aristotle has of the relationship between God and the world. The world is maintained in a sort of dynamic process out of the theocentric desire to imitate or approximate to the eternal energy or activity of God. So when Aristotle speaks of being qua being, ancient readers up to the time of Plotinus seem to mean only God is only being. Rightly or wrongly, Aristotle's earliest inheritors seem to take the phrase being as a kind of definition of the divinity. The task of the leisurely philosopher is to become as godlike as possible. As in the Nicomachean Ethics, where Aristotle says that the highest form of happiness lies in the activity of theoria or pure contemplation, and he goes on to claim that the activity which brings the greatest happiness to man must be that which imitates the activity of God. Pure theory, the activity of God which surpasses all others in blessedness, must be a contemplation, and of the human activities, therefore, that which is most closely akin to happiness. And so reason, nous, as Aristotle says, is the best thing in us and the most divine element in our nature, or physis. Aristotle's own words, if the gods have any care for human affairs, as they are thought to have, it would be reasonable both that they should delight in that which was the best and most akin to them, i.e. reason, and that they should reward those who love and honor this most, as caring for the things that are dear for them and acting both rightly and nobly, and that all these attributes belong most of all to the philosopher is manifest. He is therefore dearest to the gods, and he who is so will presumably also be the happiest, so that in his way will more than any other be happy. Interestingly, although Aristotle's analyses often hover in the background of later Hellenistic schools of philosophy, such as Epicureanism, Stoicism, or Skepticism, by Cicero's time and beyond, it was, quote, Aristotle's apparent denial of divine providence that has given greatest scandal and caused many commentators to deny that Aristotle has any real conception of religion at all. In other words, Aristotle's contemplative God is the model which all nature itself aspires to, other than a creative agent who constantly intervenes and so creates providence. Book 10 of the Metaphysics provides a definition of God as pure intelligence, intellecting itself. It must be of itself that this divine thought thinks, since it is the most excellent of things, and its thinking is a thinking on thinking. This does not mean that God's intelligence is too solitary to be active in the world. On the contrary, it is a supreme activity. But it does remain true that for Aristotle, religion is primarily a matter of vision and contemplation of God, without there being any expectation of reciprocal interest or concern from God. This was simply not as appealing to many Hellenistic as well as later Christian philosophers. Conclusion on theology, which is the heart of Aristotle's metaphysics, Charlesworth writes, even if we cannot claim Aristotle to be a God-intoxicated man, nevertheless it is clear that for him, as for Plato, philosophy is itself a religious way of life, in that through philosophy we approximate to the highest degree possible to the life of God. Aristotle is certainly not a cold rationalist suspicious of religion, rather he is, in line with Plato, concerned to show that the culmination of philosophy is true religion. Okay, infinitely more to say about Aristotle's physics and metaphysics, other scientific works, and also other works in the Organon. I hope this brief overview video has sufficed to give us a general introduction to Aristotle's logic, physics, and metaphysics, and I look forward to seeing you next week when we cover On the Soul, the Ethics, the Politics, and various miscellaneous surviving and lost works by Aristotle. Have a good week.